The International Monetary Fund, widely known as the IMF, has long stood as one of the most powerful financial institutions in the modern world. Its influence stretches across continents, often determining the fate of developing economies with the stroke of a pen. In the heart of Africa, in the landlocked nation of Burkina Faso, a confrontation is now unfolding that has stunned Western governments, financial analysts, and ordinary citizens alike. The IMF has issued a stern notice to the government of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, demanding an immediate repayment of $700 million. The institution expects compliance. But Ibrahim Traoré, Africa's youngest leader, has responded in a way that few expected, sending shockwaves across the West and igniting conversations about sovereignty, debt, and the future of Africa's independence from external control. To understand the weight of this moment, one must first recognize what the IMF represents in the global financial system. Since its creation in the aftermath of the Second World War, the IMF has operated as a lender of last resort for nations in financial distress. However, critics argue that its so-called assistance often comes at a steep price, locking nations into cycles of dependency, austerity, and external influence. African nations in particular have been among the most frequent recipients of IMF loans and also some of the most vocal critics of its practices. For decades, the IMF has been accused of perpetuating neocolonial dynamics through debt. Burkina Faso is not the largest economy in Africa, nor the wealthiest, but under Traoré's leadership, it has emerged as one of the most defiant voices against Western financial dominance. When the IMF issued its notice, its expectation was straightforward: that Burkina Faso would quietly comply, arrange emergency funds, and repay the $700 million without question. But Traoré's government saw the situation differently. Rather than bow to external pressure, Traoré used this moment to highlight what he considers the structural injustice of global finance. His response was sharp, defiant, and unapologetic. Instead of promising immediate repayment, he questioned the very legitimacy of the IMF's demands. In a statement that resonated across Africa, Traoré asserted that Burkina Faso would not allow international creditors to dictate its destiny, especially when those same creditors have played a role in keeping African nations underdeveloped and indebted for generations. This reaction was not simply about the money owed. It was about symbolism, sovereignty, and the right of a nation to prioritize its own people over foreign demands. Traoré's response has fueled a fiery debate across the world. In Western capitals, analysts worry about the precedent being set. If Burkina Faso, a country often seen as fragile and vulnerable, can openly challenge the IMF, what might happen if larger African nations follow suit? Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya are all nations with significant IMF exposure. If a wave of defiance spreads, the entire financial architecture of the West's engagement with Africa could be destabilized. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction to the IMF's notice was very different. Citizens took to the streets in demonstrations, not of fear, but of solidarity with their young leader. To many Burkinabe people, Traoré's defiance represented something deeply personal. For decades, they have felt the weight of external control, whether from colonial France, multinational corporations, or financial institutions like the IMF. The demand for $700 million felt less like a neutral financial transaction and more like an attack on the nation's sovereignty. Traoré's refusal to bow quickly to the IMF earned him admiration not only in his country, but across the African continent. Financial experts within the West argue that the IMF is simply enforcing its rules that Burkina Faso agreed to when it accepted previous loans. To them, the repayment demand is not about neocolonialism, but about financial discipline and credibility. However, to many African thinkers and leaders, this narrative ignores the unequal playing field on which such agreements are made. Nations like Burkina Faso often turn to the IMF under duress when their economies are already battered by global shocks, falling commodity prices, or political instability. The conditions of the loans, often dictated by external economists with little regard for local realities, impose harsh austerity measures that reduce public spending, cut social programs, and stifle development. The $700 million repayment demand, therefore, is not seen in isolation. It is part of a larger pattern in which African nations are forced to prioritize creditors over their own citizens. Ibrahim Traoré, at just his early 30s, represents a generational shift in African leadership. Unlike many of his predecessors, who quietly complied with international dictates, Traoré has built his political identity around defiance and sovereignty. He has repeatedly spoken of the need for Africa to break free from dependency, whether on Western militaries, corporations, or financial institutions. His rejection of the IMF's demand is consistent with this vision. He argues that Africa possesses immense natural wealth, gold, uranium, agricultural land, and human talent, that can sustain its development if only managed independently. In his speeches, he frequently reminds his citizens that Burkina Faso should not be begging for survival when its soil contains enough resources to build prosperity. The IMF notice has therefore become more than a financial dispute. It has become a stage in which the larger struggle between Africa and the West is being acted out. In this struggle, Traoré has positioned himself as a champion of African dignity, refusing to let international institutions dictate the terms of his country's future. His defiance resonates particularly strongly among Africa's youth, who are increasingly impatient with the status quo. For young Africans, the IMF is not seen as a savior, but as a relic of the old world order that has perpetuated inequality and dependency. Traoré's stance, therefore, is both politically strategic and ideologically charged. The West, however, does not take such defiance lightly. Already, financial analysts are warning that Burkina Faso may face credit downgrades, investment slowdowns, and even sanctions if it refuses to comply with the IMF's demands. Western governments are concerned that Traoré's boldness might inspire similar resistance in other parts of the global South. Some reports suggest that, behind the scenes, Western diplomats are pressuring Burkina Faso with threats of economic isolation. Yet such measures may backfire. In a global economy that is increasingly multipolar, with rising powers like China, Russia, India, and the Gulf states willing to provide financial alternatives, the West no longer holds uncontested leverage over African nations. If Burkina Faso is punished by the IMF, it may simply pivot further toward these alternative partners. Indeed, this is already happening. Traoré has signaled that Burkina Faso is exploring new trade and financial arrangements outside the Western-dominated system. There are discussions about expanding ties with BRICS nations, seeking alternative loans from China or Russia, and deepening cooperation with fellow African states. Such moves would reduce the IMF's leverage and further weaken the dominance of Western-led institutions. This possibility alarms policymakers in Washington, London, and Paris, who see Burkina Faso's defiance not as an isolated event, but as part of a growing trend in which African nations are asserting independence from traditional Western control. What makes this confrontation particularly striking is its timing. The global financial system is under strain, with rising interest rates, growing debt burdens, and increasing discontent across the global South. Many nations are questioning the legitimacy of institutions like the IMF and World Bank, which were designed in a different era and have often failed to adapt to the realities of the 21st century. In this context, Traoré's refusal to quietly pay $700 million is more than symbolic. It is a challenge to the very foundation of the system itself. The reaction across Africa has been telling. Leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens in countries from Mali to Ghana to South Africa, are closely watching how this standoff unfolds. Some praise Traore as a visionary leader who dares to speak truth to power. Others caution that his defiance could carry risks, potentially plunging Burkina Faso into economic hardship if the IMF and its allies retaliate. But even among skeptics, there is admiration for the courage it takes to openly defy such a powerful institution. The IMF, for its part, insists that its notice is not political. Its representatives claim that Burkina Faso is simply expected to honor its commitments like any other member state. Yet few believe that the issue is purely financial. In practice, the IMF has often been influenced by the political agendas of its largest shareholders, particularly the United States and European powers. The demand for repayment, therefore, is interpreted by many as a way of disciplining a rebellious African leader who has already angered the West with his anti-French policies, his calls for African unity, and his alignment with non-Western powers. The standoff continues. The question remains, what will happen if Burkina Faso refuses to comply? Will the IMF escalate its pressure, potentially cutting the nation off from international financial markets? Or will Traoré succeed in rallying alternative partners, thereby exposing the limits of Western financial power? Either outcome carries profound implications for Africa and the world. If the IMF forces Burkina Faso into compliance, it may discourage other nations from defying the institution. But if Traoré manages to stand his ground and survive the consequences, it may embolden a wave of resistance that could fundamentally reshape the global financial order. At its core, this confrontation is about more than debt. It is about dignity, sovereignty, and the future of Africa's place in the world. Traoré's refusal to bend to the IMF reflects a deep-seated desire among many Africans to break free from a system that they believe has held them back for too long. Whether or not Burkina Faso can withstand the financial pressure, the symbolism of this moment is undeniable. It signals a growing impatience with old power structures and a determination to forge a new path, one in which Africa is no longer dictated to but speaks with its own voice. The $700 million at the heart of this dispute may seem modest in the grand scheme of global finance, but the stakes are enormous. For the IMF and the West, ensuring compliance is about maintaining credibility and control. For Traoré and Burkina Faso, resisting is about asserting independence and inspiring a continent. As this story unfolds, one thing is clear: the world is witnessing not just a financial dispute, but a defining moment in the struggle for Africa's sovereignty in the 21st century.